Uncovering the extreme horrors, slavery was even more brutal than you thought. Slavery is more than just restricting the movement of black people and providing them with clothes that can barely cover them up. Slavery is a brutal practice. These people were physically abused. They were stripped and whipped for being in existence and beaten even more if they made mistakes. Unfortunately, it doesn't even stop there. The enslaved black people were sexually abused too. Tragic, right? Besides rape, the enslaved people were mauled in other ways too. To know the different ways they were abused, hit the subscribe button and journey with us as we unravel the cruelty that enslaved people passed through with their masters. The enslaved people were often subjected to manual labor, deprived of their fundamental human rights, and even separated from their loved ones. In addition to physical injury caused by beating, enslaved people suffered from chronic conditions caused by overwork and insufficient clothing. Frederick Douglass, an ex-slave, recalled going barefoot and ill-clothed all winter, suffering frostbite as a child. As if that was not enough, the white masters went as far as sleeping with them for pleasure. It's tough to imagine the pain these people would have felt. The enslaved women endured public nudity, nude physical auction examination to determine reproductive ability, rape for sexual pleasure and economic purposes, reproducing children who had become enslaved, and hypersexualization. The rape of enslaved women wasn't a crime in any slaveholding state. The masters used different methods to rape them. Sometimes they're forcefully raped. Other times they're enticed by being promised better beds, food, or clothes if they lie with them. These women couldn't even be blamed because they needed these things, and if they refused, they would be sold off to other enslavers, which wasn't a good thing because they would be separated from their loved ones. Many enslaved black women couldn't escape this assault, especially those who worked on the plantation farm. They were more at risk because they worked close to white men. The enslaved women's responses to the white men varied. Some resisted, while others obliged for the sake of self-preservation. Elizabeth Keckley, who was born into slavery in Virginia and taken by her enslavers to North Carolina, said in her narrative Behind the Scenes, or 30 years an enslaved person and 4 years in the White House, 1868, of being repeatedly raped by a son of a wealthy plantation owner who lived nearby. Eventually, she gave birth to a son he fathered. The sons of the enslavers walked in their father's footsteps too. In 1826, it was recorded that 2 students at the University of Virginia raped a 16-year-old enslaved woman and later stripped her naked and beat her for giving them a venereal disease, as recounted by Alan Taylor in Thomas Jefferson's Education, 2019. Harriet Jacob, in her memoir, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, described how her master's sexual advances impacted her at a young age. Jacob's understandings of her right is consistent with slavery-era law, which didn't recognize rape against black women as a crime. She was wooed by her master's teachers and even her master's sons. They tried bribing her with presents and other material things. They whipped her to bend to their will when she didn't oblige. Contrary to popular opinion, black women weren't the only ones being sexually assaulted. Black men were sexually assaulted too. They were assaulted by both white men and women, especially the planter-class white women. The light-skinned enslaved men were the target most of the time for sexual predation. Male enslavers used sexual assault to dominate and dehumanize enslaved men. They forced these men to sleep with other slave women so they could reproduce children who would, in turn, work as enslaved people when they were older. These children, though, weren't allowed to stay with their mothers. They were sold out to other enslavers for the sake of the dignity of the master's wife. This coerced reproduction affected interpersonal relationships between the enslaved men and women, because the woman who ends up being the one to be slept with would see the enslaved man as an evil person, even though he was forced to do it and probably hates it more than she does. Another form of sexual assault against men was how the enslaved men's bodies were treated. The enslaved men's bodies were objectified through several cultural forms. The objectification of enslaved men depicted in paintings often resembled everyday acts of terror, including the public inspection of black men's genitals, whippings and lashings, and bodily exposure due to inadequate clothing. Sexual violence committed against enslaved men was emasculating, because it meant they had no control over their bodies. The sexual abuse against black men took away any agency they had, especially if white women abused them. Traditionally, it is believed that men are the dominant gender, so for a woman to sexually use them, it signified that they were so weak that they could not prevent a woman they usually had control over. Most times, the reason black men were sexually abused by white women, apart from pleasure, is for the sake of power and dominance. They did it to maintain their status in the class hierarchy. Early European travelers had long depicted black women as incredibly fertile and hypersexual, a view carried over to enslaved women to justify sexual contact without consent. They were scrutinized and groped. The enslavers were financially interested in enslaved people's reproduction because children born to enslaved women automatically inherited their mother's enslaved status. An increase in enslaved children equals an increase in wealth, so coercion between the enslaved men and women had to occur, whether forced or willingly. Most enslaved teenage girls voluntarily settle on a partner of their choice quickly to avoid their master choosing them because it was better that way. The enslaved people also experienced psychological trauma. No Mommy Me by Joyce Scott captures the tragedy of the neglected black child. While the mother plays with the white child in her charge, her child, disregarded, clings to her skirt. The enslaved people were not to appear thinking for themselves or to display any emotions following physical violence, whether being beaten or witnessing someone else's torture. Some enslaved people then suffered from post-traumatic stress and, as a result, inflicted their pain on their kin. Every enslaved person was psychologically vulnerable and at risk of psychological trauma. The white people weren't spared from this too. Harriet Jacobs, a sexual prey of her middle-aged master when she was less than 14, summed up slavery's cost to white families. "I was 21 years in that cage of obscene birds. I can testify from my own experience and observation that slavery is a curse to the white and the black. It makes the white father cruel and sensual, the sons violent and licentious. It contaminates the daughters and makes the wives wretched." Slavery deprived the enslaved of income and wealth. They received no wages, although some masters offered bonuses for exceptional work. Without salaries, saving was impossible, and enslaved people had no legal rights to own property, making it difficult to accumulate assets. While a few favored enslaved people were granted the use of property, ownership remained at the master's discretion. Sojourner Truth's parents, for instance, lived in a cottage and maintained a garden they considered their own. But these possessions were not legally theirs and couldn't be passed on to their children. This lack of wages, savings, and property meant Africans and their descendants couldn't send money back to their African villages, unlike immigrants from Asia and Europe. In the 19th century South, educating enslaved people in or out of school was illegal, while in the North and West, it was allowed. However, due to various factors, formal education remained out of reach for most African Americans. Few black individuals, whether enslaved or free, gained access to schools. In rural areas, schooling was a rarity, as impoverished children of all races were destined for the workforce, not the classroom. Only a tiny minority of the enslaved learned to read, write, and do arithmetic. In some cases, their owners, particularly mistresses like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs, helped bright slave children learn these skills, as enslavers valued enslaved people who could read or keep accounts. Nonetheless, improving one's skills primarily benefited the owner rather than the enslaved individuals. The enslaved people couldn't choose their employers, so they could not leverage their acquired skills to seek better working conditions or higher-paying jobs. Advancement within their occupation or purchasing a share in a business was also out of reach. Their work was closely monitored, granting them minimal control over their work environment. Although enslaved people lacked unions and grievance procedures, they occasionally managed to appeal overseers' orders to their owners. However, these appeals couldn't escalate beyond the master, as masters held direct authority over their farms, plantations, and households, and indirect control through slave patrols in public areas. In the South, local governments typically deferred to owners who wielded police power over the land and the people they owned. The combination of physical violence and the expectation to maintain a cheerful demeanor before their owners fostered habits of deception and inner turmoil that negatively impacted themselves and their families. Child and spouse abuse were ever-present threats within Southern families. The sexual assault against Black men and women in the past has made African Americans become hypersexualized. Black men are seen as sexual predators because they can't control their sexual urges, and Black women are portrayed as being sexually promiscuous and, as a result, constantly looking for sexual partners. Black slavery can also be linked to racism. The enslavement was of the idea that Africans were inferior, uncivilized, and acted like animals. This was what marked the birth of racialized slavery. A racial hierarchy was also established during the era of slavery. White European people belonged at the top, and Black Africans belonged at the bottom. In summary, slavery in the United States was vital in shaping racism. The discrimination deeply rooted in slavery had a lasting effect on American society, hence the ongoing struggle for racial equality. If you enjoyed this episode, do not forget to like, share, and click that subscribe button for more knowledge on Black history.